June 19, 1944. Admiral Matome Ugaki stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, field glasses pressed against his eyes, scanning the western horizon. The largest carrier battle in history was unfolding before him, and in the span of the next 6 hours, he would witness something that would shatter every assumption Japanese naval command had held about winning this war. Through the haze of anti-aircraft fire and burning aircraft, Ugaki counted them. American carriers. Not 3 or 4 as intelligence had suggested, not even the 6 or 7 that seemed plausible. 15 American carriers were operating in coordinated task groups, launching wave after wave of aircraft with mechanical precision. His diary that evening would record a single devastating observation. The war was not being lost in battles. It was being lost in American shipyards, and there was absolutely nothing Japan could do to stop it. What Ugaki was witnessing at the Battle of the Philippine Sea was not simply a tactical defeat. It was the material manifestation of a strategic miscalculation so profound that it had doomed Japan's war effort before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. The Americans had built an industrial system that could produce fleet carriers faster than Japan could train the pilots to oppose them. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Matome Ugaki was not a romantic, he was a calculator. Born in 1890 in rural Okayama Prefecture, he had entered the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy in 1909 and graduated 9th in a class of 144 cadets. His career had been built on precision, on understanding the mathematics of naval warfare, on calculating tonnage and fuel consumption and range. By 1941, he had risen to become Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. His role was specific. When Yamamoto proposed an operation, Ugaki's job was to calculate whether it would work, not whether it should work philosophically, not whether it aligned with Bushido spirit, but whether the numbers added up. And in late 1941, Ugaki had run the numbers on Japan's carrier strength. The Imperial Japanese Navy possessed 10 fleet carriers. The Americans had 7 split between 2 oceans. Japan held numerical superiority in the Pacific. The plan was to strike Pearl Harbor, eliminate American carrier strength in the opening blow, then consolidate Southeast Asia during a 6-month window before American production could respond. Ugaki had calculated that window carefully. 6 months. That was how long Japan needed to secure the resources and defensive perimeter that would make the war too costly for America to continue. After 6 months, American industrial capacity would begin to matter, but by then Japan's position would be unassailable, and negotiation would follow. The calculation had one critical assumption: American carrier production would require years to replace losses. Pre-war carriers like USS Yorktown and USS Enterprise had required 3 to 4 years from keel laying to commissioning. Even with accelerated wartime production, Ugaki had assumed American yards would need at least 2 years to produce new fleet carriers. This assumption was not pulled from thin air. It was based on Japan's own experience. Japanese shipyards, among the finest in the world, required 18 to 24 months to produce a fleet carrier under optimal conditions. The idea that American yards could work faster than Japanese yards seemed to violate everything Ugaki understood about precision shipbuilding. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The attack proceeded exactly as planned. 8 American battleships were sunk or severely damaged. The American Pacific Fleet was crippled. Japanese losses were minimal. The tactical victory was absolute. For a brief moment, Ugaki's calculation seemed validated, but something was happening that Ugaki had not anticipated, something that was not part of any calculation. In American shipyards, from Newport News to Philadelphia to New York, a different kind of mobilization was underway. The Essex-class carrier program had begun in July 1940 before Pearl Harbor. 3 hulls had been laid down by December 7th. Orders for 10 more were placed before January 1942, but these were not the slow, methodical construction projects that Japanese planners understood. American shipyards were about to demonstrate something that would fundamentally alter the mathematics of the Pacific War. USS Essex herself was laid down on April 28, 1941 at Newport News Shipbuilding. After Pearl Harbor, her construction contract was reworked and accelerated. She was launched on July 31, 1942. She was commissioned on December 31, 1942. Total construction time, 20 months. This was already faster than Japanese yards could manage, but it was just the beginning. USS Yorktown, the second Essex-class carrier, was laid down on December 1, 1941. She was commissioned on April 15, 1943. Construction time, 16.5 months. USS Franklin, built at the same Newport News yard as Essex, was laid down in December 1942 and commissioned in January 1944. Construction time, 14 months. 14 months. From keel to operational carrier in 14 months. This was a construction rate that Japanese planners had considered physically impossible. Quality shipbuilding required time, precision, careful craftsmanship. You could not rush such things without producing inferior vessels, yet the Americans were doing exactly that, and the ships were not inferior. They were superb. What Ugaki did not understand in early 1943 was that American shipyards had fundamentally reimagined the carrier construction process. Instead of treating each ship as a unique craft project, American yards had implemented mass production techniques. Components were standardized, sections were prefabricated, assembly processes were streamlined. Workers who had never built ships before Pearl Harbor were trained in weeks to perform specialized tasks with remarkable precision. By August 1943, the first Essex-class carriers reached Pearl Harbor. USS Essex and USS Yorktown arrived within days of each other. They were followed in the same month by USS Lexington, USS Bunker Hill, and the light carriers USS Independence and USS Princeton. In a single month, 5 new American carriers became operational in the Pacific. Ugaki received the intelligence reports in late 1943. The numbers did not make sense. American carrier strength in the Pacific had increased from 3 operational carriers in June 1942 to 9 by December 1943, and the intelligence suggested more were coming, many more. He began making new calculations. If the Americans could produce carriers at this rate, and if the rate was accelerating, then Japan's 6-month window was not simply closing. It had never actually existed. Every month the war continued, American numerical superiority would increase. Japan had no industrial answer to this production rate. None. By January 1944, Ugaki had access to more comprehensive intelligence. The picture it painted was devastating. The United States had not simply built a few new carriers. They had created an entirely new class of carriers and were producing them on an industrial scale. 17 Essex-class carriers were under construction or already commissioned. More were being ordered. But it was not just the carriers themselves. Each Essex-class carrier required a screen of destroyers and cruisers for protection. It required a logistical train of oilers and supply ships to sustain operations. It required trained pilots, maintenance crews, ordnance specialists. The Americans were producing all of this simultaneously. Ugaki compared this to Japan's situation. Since Pearl Harbor, Japan had commissioned exactly 3 fleet carriers. All 3 had been laid down before the war began. IJN Junyo and IJN Hio were conversions from ocean liners, not purpose-built fleet carriers. IJN Taiho was Japan's only true new fleet carrier design, and she had required 3 years from keel laying to commissioning. Japan's shipyards were now fully occupied with repairs and maintenance. The carrier, IJN Shokaku, had been damaged twice in 1942 and spent 31 weeks in dry dock. Japan lacked the industrial capacity to simultaneously repair damaged ships, maintain operational vessels, and construct new carriers at scale. More critically, Japan lacked the escorts. Each carrier required multiple destroyers and cruisers as protection. By late 1943, Japanese destroyer losses in the Solomons campaign had reduced the destroyer fleet to 46% of its December 19, 41 strength. There were not enough escorts to screen the carriers Japan already possessed, let alone new construction. And then there was the pilot problem. Training a competent carrier pilot required hundreds of hours of flight time. Before the war, Japanese naval pilots trained for 700 hours or more. American pilots in December 1941 trained for approximately 300 hours, but by 1943, the situation had reversed. American pilot training programs had expanded dramatically. New pilots were receiving 600 to 800 hours of training before deployment. They trained over friendly territory with ample fuel supplies and modern aircraft. The training pipeline was producing more pilots than were being lost in combat. Japan's pilot training program had collapsed. Fuel shortages meant training flights were limited. Combat losses were exceeding replacement rates. By mid-1944, Japanese pilots were being deployed with as few as 40 to 70 hours of training. They were being sent into combat against American pilots with 10 times their experience, flying aircraft with superior performance characteristics. Ugaki understood what this meant. Even if Japan could somehow match American carrier production, which it could not, Japan lacked the pilots to operate them effectively. The mathematics were absolute. The war was no longer winnable through any conventional calculation. April 18, 1943. Ugaki's calculation framework was shattered in the most personal way possible. He and Admiral Yamamoto were traveling in separate Mitsubishi bombers over Bougainville when American P-38 fighters intercepted them. Yamamoto's aircraft was shot down. He was killed instantly. Ugaki's plane crashed into the sea at high speed. He was one of 3 survivors, seriously injured, evacuated to a hospital. As Ugaki recovered from his injuries through May and June 1943, he had time to process what the intelligence reports were saying. The Americans were not simply producing more carriers, they were producing carriers faster than Japan could respond to their deployment. The Essex-class program alone would deliver more carriers in 2 years than Japan had possessed at the start of the war. By the time Ugaki returned to active duty, taking command of the 1st Battleship Division in August 1943, the strategic situation had deteriorated further. The Americans had secured Guadalcanal. They were advancing through the Central Pacific, and with each advance came more carriers, new carriers, fresh crews, overwhelming air power. Ugaki's battleship division included the Yamato and the Musashi, the 2 largest battleships ever constructed. They had been built on the assumption that their massive firepower would be decisive in the battleship versus battleship engagements that traditional naval warfare theory predicted. But carrier warfare had rendered this assumption obsolete. These magnificent battleships existed primarily to screen carriers from air attack, a defensive role for which they were grotesquely overbuilt. Throughout late 1943 and early 1944, Ugaki watched the intelligence reports with growing dread. Every month brought news of another American carrier commissioning: USS Intrepid in August, USS Hornet in November, USS Wasp in November, USS Hancock in April 1944, USS Ticonderoga in May. The names kept coming. And it was not just fleet carriers. The Americans had also commissioned 9 Independence-class light carriers in 1943. These were smaller, faster conversions from cruiser hulls, carrying fewer aircraft but adding flexibility to task force operations. Japan had attempted similar conversions with the carriers Chitose and Chiyoda, but the scale was incomparable. 2 Japanese conversions versus 9 American conversions, all completed in a single year, May 19, 44. Ugaki's battleship division was ordered to prepare for a major operation. American forces had landed on Biak Island. Admiral Toyoda, now commanding the combined fleet, saw this as an opportunity to engage American carrier forces in the long-awaited decisive battle. The operation was called Conforce. Ugaki argued forcefully that Japan had a strategic imperative to hold Biak. The island controlled key sea lanes, But more fundamentally, Ugaki recognized that Japan's window for a decisive naval engagement was rapidly closing. Every month that passed saw more American carriers arrive in theatre. If there was to be a battle that could alter the trajectory of the war, it had to happen soon. But on June 12, 1944, the operation was postponed. American forces had begun bombarding Saipan in the Mariana Islands. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was about to begin. Ugaki's battleships joined the mobile force, deploying for the defense of the Marianas. The Japanese plan was built around a calculated advantage. American carriers would be operating near Saipan, tied to protecting the invasion force. Japanese carriers could operate from longer range, using land-based aircraft from Philippine and Marianas airfields to supplement their carrier air groups. On paper, this force multiplication should have compensated for American numerical superiority. But the plan depended on assumptions that were no longer valid. Japanese intelligence suggested the Americans would have perhaps 8 to 10 carriers in the area. The actual number was 15. Task Force 58, under Admiral Mark Mitcher, had assembled the largest concentration of carrier power ever deployed. 15 carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, 69 destroyers, over 900 aircraft. Against this, Admiral Ozawa's mobile force had 9 carriers, 5 battleships, 13 cruisers, 28 destroyers, approximately 450 aircraft. The Japanese were outnumbered 2 to 1 in carriers, 2 to 1 in aircraft, and critically, the quality gap had widened dramatically. June 19, 1944, 0630 hours. Ugaki was on the bridge of Yamato as dawn broke over the Philippine Sea. Japanese search planes reported American carrier forces approximately 300 miles to the east. Ozawa made the decision to attack. Beginning at 0830, the Japanese launched 4 consecutive airstrikes, totaling 373 aircraft. Ugaki watched through field glasses as the first wave launched. He knew the pilots. Many had fewer than 100 hours of training. They were flying into battle against American pilots with 800 hours or more. They were flying aircraft that lacked self-sealing fuel tanks and adequate armor. And they were flying toward the most concentrated anti-aircraft firepower ever assembled at sea. What happened next would be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots. It was not a battle. It was a massacre. The first Japanese strike of 69 aircraft was detected by American radar at over 100 miles. F-6F Hellcat fighters were launched to intercept long before the Japanese reached the carrier screen. The Hellcat was a revelation. It combined superior speed, armor protection, and firepower with the ruggedness to absorb battle damage. Against the aging A-6M0, which remained Japan's primary carrier fighter, the Hellcat held every advantage. But the decisive factor was not the aircraft. It was the pilots. American fighter pilots had been trained extensively in the Thatch weave and other mutual support tactics. They fought as coordinated teams, using radio communication to vector reinforcements to threatened areas. Japanese pilots, many seeing their first combat, fought individually using tactics that had been effective in 1942 but were now obsolete. The American defensive system was equally revolutionary. The Combat Information Center on each carrier coordinated fighter direction based on radar plots. Controllers could see the entire tactical picture and position fighters to intercept incoming raids with maximum efficiency. This integration of sensors, communications, and fighters created a layered defense that Japanese strike aircraft simply could not penetrate. Of the 69 aircraft in the first strike, 42 were shot down before reaching the American carriers. Those that survived the fighter screen faced a second barrier, the most concentrated anti-aircraft fire ever deployed. The Essex-class carriers mounted multiple quadruple 40mm and twin 20mm anti-aircraft guns. Their escort ships added hundreds more guns to the defensive screen. But the Americans possessed something else, something the Japanese could not match and had not fully anticipated. The proximity fuse. This top-secret weapon used a miniature radar in each anti-aircraft shell to detonate when near an aircraft, creating a sphere of shrapnel that did not require a direct hit. The effectiveness of this weapon was devastating. Japanese aircraft began exploding in mid-air from shells that appeared to miss them. The second Japanese strike launched at 0:56 with 128 aircraft. The result was identical to the first. American fighters intercepted the formation far from the carriers. 97 aircraft were shot down. Not a single American carrier was hit. The third strike of 47 aircraft launched at 10 hours. Again, American fighters intercepted and destroyed the formation. 6 aircraft survived to attempt attacks. All failed, 0 hits. The fourth strike of 82 aircraft was the most tragic. Due to navigation errors, most have never found the American fleet. Those that did were systematically destroyed by fighters and anti-aircraft fire. 73 aircraft were lost. By 1500 hours, the one-sided air battle was over. The Japanese had launched 373 aircraft. Only 130 returned to their carriers. 243 aircraft had been destroyed in a single day. More critically, 243 pilots had been killed. Irreplaceable pilots, the last generation of reasonably trained Japanese naval aviators, had been annihilated. Ugaki recorded the losses in his diary that evening. His handwriting was precise despite the shock. He noted not just the tactical defeat but what it represented. The Americans had not simply won an air battle. They had demonstrated that Japanese naval aviation no longer posed a credible threat to American carrier operations. The quality gap had become so wide that Japanese pilots could not even reach their targets, let alone damage them. But the disaster was not limited to aircraft losses. While the air battle raged, American submarines had penetrated the Japanese carrier screen. USS Albacore torpedoed and sank the fleet carrier IJN Taiho, Japan's newest and most heavily armoured carrier, on her first operational deployment. USS Kavala torpedoed and sank the fleet carrier IJN Hio, 2 fleet carriers lost in a single day, adding to the 243 aircraft destroyed. The Battle of the Philippine Sea continued into a second day. On June 20th, American carriers launched their own strikes against the retreating Japanese fleet. They sank one more carrier, IJN Hio, and damaged several other ships. The Japanese mobile force, which had sortied with 9 carriers, limped back to Okinawa with 6 carriers so severely depleted of aircraft and pilots that they were effectively useless. Ugaki spent the night of June 20th calculating the losses. 3 fleet carriers sunk, over 600. Aircraft destroyed. Hundreds of trained pilots killed. The American losses were comparatively trivial. 123 aircraft lost, mostly to fuel exhaustion during night recoveries. 0 carriers damaged. 0 capital ships lost. The exchange ratio was approximately 6-1 in aircraft, infinity to 1 in carriers, but the numbers alone did not capture the full scope of the defeat. Japan had lost its last operational reserve of carrier-qualified pilots. The training pipeline could not replace them. The few remaining experienced pilots could not train new pilots fast enough. From this point forward, every Japanese carrier operation would be flown by pilots with minimal training, facing American pilots with overwhelming advantages in experience, aircraft quality, and supporting systems. Ugaki understood what Admiral Spruance had achieved. The American commander had not prioritized sinking Japanese carriers. He had prioritized destroying Japanese naval aviation. Carriers, without aircraft, were merely expensive targets. By annihilating Japan's air groups while preserving his own, Spruance had achieved something more decisive than sinking ships. He had eliminated Japan's ability to conduct carrier warfare. Throughout July and August 1944, Ugaki received regular intelligence updates on American carrier operations. The Essex-class carriers were arriving at a rate of approximately 1 per month. USS Bennington in August, USS Bonhomme Richard in November, USS Leyte in April 1945. The production continued relentlessly. But what shocked Ugaki most was not simply the number of carriers. It was the realization of how long this production had been underway. The Americans had not begun building these carriers after Pearl Harbor in a reactive panic. They had begun in July 1940. They had anticipated the need for massive carrier expansion before the war even started. They had planned for a long war. They had built the industrial infrastructure to win a long war. Japan had planned for a short war, a 6-month window, a decisive battle, negotiations. The entire strategic framework had been built on the assumption that Japan could not win a prolonged industrial conflict with the United States. Therefore, Japan had to win quickly. The problem was that the Americans had never intended to lose quickly. They had built carrier production lines designed to operate continuously for years. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Ugaki began reviewing pre-war intelligence estimates. Japanese naval planners had known that American industrial capacity exceeded Japan's capacity by a significant margin. They had known this, but they had not understood the velocity. They had not understood that American factories could shift from peacetime to wartime production at speeds that Japanese industry could not match. In 1943 alone, American shipyards produced 47,836 military aircraft. Japan produced 8,861. The ratio was better than 5-1. In 1944, American production reached 85,898 aircraft. Japan produced 16,693. The gap was not closing, it was accelerating. The same pattern held for every category of war material: liberty ships, destroyers, submarines, tanks, artillery, ammunition. The Americans were producing at rates that Japanese planners had not considered physically possible, and they were sustaining these production rates month after month, year after year, while simultaneously fighting a two-ocean war. Ugaki compared this to Japan's situation. Japanese factories were running at maximum capacity but could not increase output. Resources were increasingly constrained. Shipping losses meant that raw materials could not reliably reach factories. Skilled workers were being drafted into military service, reducing industrial efficiency. Japan's production was declining even as American production continued to climb. The carrier disparity illustrated the problem perfectly. By June 1944, the United States Navy had 29 fleet and light carriers operational. Japan had 9. By December 1944, the Americans had increased to 32 carriers. Japan had decreased to 6. By the war's end, the ratio would be even more extreme. October 1944. The Battle of Leyte Gulf. Ugaki's battleship division participated in what would become the largest naval battle in history. The battle was Japan's last attempt to destroy American amphibious forces and alter the trajectory of the war. It was a desperate gamble, built on a desperate plan. The Japanese strategy used the remaining carriers as bait. The carriers, now with virtually no aircraft aboard, would lure American carrier forces away from Leyte Gulf. Meanwhile, Japanese battleships, including Yamato, would strike the vulnerable amphibious forces. The plan assumed American commanders would prioritize sinking carriers over protecting transports. Ugaki understood the implications of this strategy. Japanese carriers, which 3 years earlier had been the most powerful naval striking force ever assembled, were now considered expendable decoys. They had no other military value. Their aircraft were gone. Their pilots were dead. They existed only to draw American attention away from the real attack. The plan achieved some success. American carriers pursued the Japanese decoy force and sank all 4 carriers. But at Leyte Gulf itself, Ugaki witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His battleship division, including the mighty Yamato, encountered a group of American escort carriers and destroyers. These were not fleet carriers. These were small, slow escort carriers designed for anti-submarine patrol and supporting amphibious operations. The Japanese battleships and cruisers possessed overwhelming firepower superiority. The largest battleship in the world was firing on tiny escort carriers. The battle should have been a massacre. Instead, it became an embarrassment. The American destroyers conducted aggressive torpedo attacks that disrupted Japanese formations. The escort carriers launched their aircraft, which conducted continuous harassment attacks despite having minimal anti-ship weapons. And, critically, the American commanders executed their defense with an aggression and tactical flexibility that the Japanese could not match. Ugaki watched as the engagement devolved into chaos. The Yamato maneuvered to avoid torpedo attacks rather than prosecuting firing solutions against the carriers. Cruisers pursued damaged destroyers instead of focusing on the primary targets. Communications broke down, and after several hours of confused fighting, the order came to withdraw. The invasion force at Leyte Gulf remained intact. The mission had failed. The Battle of Leyte Gulf ended any illusion that Japan could win the naval war. The combined fleet had committed virtually its entire remaining strength. 4 carriers sunk, 3 battleships sunk, including the Musashi, Yamato's sister ship, 6 heavy cruisers sunk, thousands of sailors dead. And for what? The Americans continued their operations at Leyte without significant delay. The sacrifice had achieved nothing. November 1944, Ugaki was recalled to Japan and assigned to the Naval General Staff. In February 1945, he was appointed commander of the 5th Air Fleet, based on Kyushu. His mission was to direct the aerial defense of Japan using kamikaze attacks, suicide attacks, the last resort of a military that had exhausted all other options. Ugaki's new command included hundreds of aircraft, but very few experienced pilots. The remaining pilots had minimal training. Many had never landed on an aircraft carrier. Some had fewer than 50 hours total flight time. They were being asked to fly one-way missions against the most powerful naval force ever assembled. From his headquarters bunker on Kyushu, Ugaki planned the kamikaze operations against American forces off Okinawa, wave after wave of suicide attacks. Young pilots climbing into aircraft they barely knew how to fly, carrying bombs they would never release, aiming to crash into American ships. It was the ultimate admission of defeat. Japan could no longer compete in conventional warfare, so it had resorted to trading lives for minimal tactical gains. The kamikazes achieved some successes. Several American ships were sunk, more were damaged. But the fundamental equation remained unchanged. For every American ship damaged, dozens of Japanese aircraft and pilots were lost, and the Americans were replacing their losses while Japan could not. Essex-class carriers hit by kamikazes were repaired within weeks and returned to operations. Japan had no such capacity. Ugaki watched the casualty reports accumulate through March, April, and May 1945. Thousands of young pilots were dead. They had died bravely. They had died following orders, but they had died for nothing. The American advance had not been stopped. It had barely been delayed. The industrial mathematics were absolute. In his diary, Ugaki wrote extensively about American carrier operations off Okinawa. At any given time, 15 to 20 American carriers were operating in the area. They maintained constant combat air patrols. They launched systematic strikes against Japanese airfields. They provided continuous close air support for ground operations. And they did this for months without interruption, because they possessed the logistical infrastructure to sustain such operations indefinitely. Japan could not sustain operations for months. Japan could barely sustain operations for weeks. Fuel was critically short. Replacement aircraft could not reach Okinawa through the American blockade. The few aircraft that did arrive were immediately thrown into kamikaze attacks because there was no fuel for extended training, no spare parts for maintenance, no time for tactical planning. July 1945. American carrier aircraft began systematic raids on Japanese home islands. They struck with impunity. Japanese air defenses were so depleted that raids proceeded without significant opposition. At Kure Naval Base, American carrier aircraft attacked the remaining Japanese carriers. IJN Amagi was sunk. IJN Katsuragi was heavily damaged. The battleships Issei and Hyuga, which had been partially converted to carry aircraft, were both sunk at their moorings on July 28. Ugaki recorded the attacks in his diary. He noted the professional efficiency of American operations, the systematic approach, the overwhelming firepower, the complete air superiority. Japan had no response, no counter, no strategy that could alter the outcome. August 6, 1945. Hiroshima. The atomic bomb. Ugaki learned of the weapon through military channels. The reports were fragmentary and difficult to believe. A single bomb had destroyed an entire city. Casualties were estimated in the tens of thousands. The weapon utilized atomic fission. America had developed and deployed a weapon that transcended conventional warfare entirely. August 9th. Nagasaki, a second atomic bomb. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. The strategic situation had become completely untenable. Japan could not win. Japan could not negotiate. Japan could only surrender or face complete annihilation. August 15th, 1945. Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast. Ugaki listened in his headquarters bunker. The war was over. Japan had lost. Everything he had calculated in 1941 had been wrong. Every assumption had proven false. The 6-month window had never existed. The decisive battle had never been possible. The war had been unwinnable from the moment it began. After listening to the emperor's announcement, Ugaki made a final entry in his diary. He wrote that he had not yet received an official ceasefire order. He wrote that as commander of the 5th Air Fleet, he bore responsibility for the failure to stop the American advance. He wrote that he would fly one last kamikaze mission to demonstrate the true spirit of Bushido. His staff protested. The war was over. Further attacks would violate the surrender terms. They would be meaningless. But Ugaki insisted. He climbed into the rear seat of a Yokosuka D-4Y dive bomber. The pilot was Lieutenant Tatsuo Nakatsuru. As they prepared to launch, Warrant Officer Akiyoshi Endo, whose place Ugaki had taken, climbed into the same space, refusing to be left behind. The aircraft took off with 3 men aboard. 10 additional aircraft accompanied them as escorts. They flew south toward Okinawa, toward the American fleet, toward a target that no longer mattered because the war was already over. None of the aircraft returned. Ugaki's body was never recovered. His last mission achieved nothing except to add 11 more names to the list of Japanese killed in a war that had been lost long before they died. The truth that Ugaki had finally understood but could never accept was this. Japan had lost the war in American shipyards. Every calculation about decisive battles and 6-month windows had been rendered meaningless by a simple industrial reality. The Americans could build carriers faster than Japan could sink them. They could train pilots faster than Japan could kill them. They could produce aircraft faster than Japan could destroy them. The Essex-class carrier program alone illustrated the disparity. Between 1942 and 1945, American shipyards completed 17 Essex-class carriers that saw combat in World War II. 7 more were completed after the war ended. 24 carriers total from a single class. Japan completed 0 new fleet carriers during the war. Every carrier Japan deployed in 1944 and 1945 had been laid down before Pearl Harbor. The construction times told the story. USS Essex, 20 months. USS Yorktown, 16.5 months. USS Franklin, 14 months. These were not rushed jobs producing inferior ships. These were magnificent carriers that would serve through the Korean War, through the Vietnam War, with some remaining in service until 1991. The last Essex-class carrier, USS Lexington, was not retired until 1991, 50 years after her keel was laid. Japan could not comprehend this industrial capability because Japan possessed nothing comparable. Japanese shipyards worked meticulously, carefully, producing ships of exquisite quality, but they could not produce them quickly. And, in industrial warfare, quantity had its own quality. 24 Essex-class carriers, even if individually inferior to Japanese designs, which they were not, would defeat 9 Japanese carriers through sheer numerical superiority. But the real lesson went deeper than simple numbers. The Americans had built a system for training pilots, a system for maintaining aircraft, a system for sustaining carrier operations at sea for months, a system for repairing battle damage, a system for replacing losses, a system for learning from experience and continuously improving tactics, and most critically, a system for producing all the material necessary to support carrier warfare at a rate that overwhelmed any opponent. Japan had no such system. Japan had individual excellence. Japan had brave pilots and skilled engineers and dedicated sailors, but individual excellence could not defeat systematic superiority. Courage could not defeat logistics. Fighting spirit could not defeat industrial production. Admiral Ugaki had calculated everything except what mattered most. He had calculated ship speeds and gun ranges and aircraft performance, but he had not calculated the true measure of American industrial capacity. He had not understood that American factories could mass-produce precision. He had not recognized that American shipyards could compress 24 months of work into 14 months. He had not grasped that American training programs could produce competent pilots faster than combat could eliminate them. The 6-month window that Japanese planning had depended upon was a mathematical fiction. It had assumed American production would be slow. It had assumed American resolve would be weak. It had assumed that tactical superiority would compensate for industrial inferiority. Every assumption was wrong. The war had been lost before it began because the numbers never added up. They only appeared to add up to planners who did not understand the true scale of American industrial power. Ugaki's diary survived the war. It was recovered and eventually published, providing historians with one of the most valuable Japanese accounts of the Pacific War. His observations were remarkably honest. He did not blame defeat on insufficient fighting spirit, or bad luck, or divine will. He blamed it on mathematics, on production rates, on systems, on the simple material reality that Japan could not build ships and train pilots fast enough to compete with American industry. The final irony is that Ugaki had been right to worry in 1941. He had argued for caution. He had warned that a prolonged war with America would be unwinnable, but his warnings had been overruled by officers who believed that spirit could overcome material disadvantage. They had calculated that 6 months would be sufficient. They had been catastrophically wrong. The Essex-class carriers were the physical manifestation of that miscalculation. 24 ships, each one carrying 90 aircraft, each one representing an industrial capability that Japan could not match. They were not the only factor in American victory, but they were a decisive factor. They provided the platform for American air superiority. They enabled the island-hopping campaign. They brought the war to Japan's home waters, and they did so in numbers that made victory inevitable. In the end, Ugaki understood that courage alone was never enough. Individual excellence was never enough. Tactical brilliance was never enough. Wars between industrial powers were won by the side that could produce more, train more, sustain more. The side with better systems would always defeat the side with better slogans. And in the Pacific War, America's shipyards had written the verdict long before the final battle was fought. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The morning of July 19th, 1944, Technical Sergeant Michael Callahan stood beneath the left wing of a P-51 Mustang at Bodney Airfield in Norfolk, England, watching a batch of fuel drain slowly into a glass jar. The liquid caught the early light, clear as water but heavier, with an oily sheen that marked it as something more potent than the standard 100-octane aviation gasoline the 8th Air Force had been using since the previous winter. This was 150-grade fuel, high-octane, experimental, and officially, it wasn't supposed to be mixed with anything else. The pilot climbing into the cockpit was First Lieutenant James Crawford, 24 years old, 18 combat missions, 3 confirmed kills. Crawford had requested Callahan specifically, after watching too many German fighters slip away from him in the vertical, their Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Fowler-Wulf 190s climbing faster than his Mustang could follow. The doctrine said to never chase them upward. Use your speed, use your range, fight on your terms. But doctrine didn't account for the frustration of watching an enemy escape when you knew your aircraft should be faster. Callahan had been a crew chief with the 352 fighter group for 9 months. He'd worked on everything from spark plugs to supercharger gears, had seen pilots return jubilant from kills, and watched others never return at all. The Mustang was a magnificent machine. Everyone said so. Long range, stable gun platform, elegant lines. But Callahan knew what the technical manuals didn't say. The aircraft was being operated well within its engineering limits, and those limits were set by lawyers and accountants, not by what the Merlin engine could actually handle. The problem wasn't the airframe or the engine. It was policy. The V1-6507 Packard Merlin, installed in every P-51D at Bodney, was rated for 61 inches of manifold pressure at military power. War emergency power, activated by breaking a safety wire on the throttle, allowed 67 inches for 5 minutes. That was the official limit. But Callahan had read the engineering data from Wright Field. He'd seen the dyno tests. The Merlin could handle more, much more, if you fed it the right fuel and didn't care about spark plug life or warranty coverage. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Callahan had started his experiments 3 weeks earlier, after a particularly bad mission on June 28th. Crawford's flight had intercepted a formation of Messerschmitts at 28,000 feet over Bavaria. The Germans had altitude advantage and dove through the American formation, then pulled up in a steep climb that the Mustangs couldn't match. Crawford had pushed his throttle past the war emergency gate, felt the engine surge to 67 inches, watched the Messerschmitt pull away anyway. 2 bombers went down that day because fighters that should have been faster weren't. Crawford came back furious. Not at himself, not at the Germans, but at the machine. "It's got more in it," he told Callahan on the hardstand that evening. "I can feel it. The engine wants to give more, but something's holding it back." Callahan didn't disagree. He'd felt the same frustration watching pilots fight an enemy that could outclimb them at will. The fuel had arrived at Bodney in early July. 150 grade, also called 100/150, developed for anti-detonation in higher boost conditions. The British were already using it in their Spitfires to chase V-1 flying bombs. The Americans had tested it at Eglin Field in Florida. Results were promising: 10 to 15 miles per hour speed increase, better climb rate, more responsive throttle. But there was a catch. Spark plugs lasted maybe 12 flight hours instead of 30. Oil temperatures ran higher. Engine wear increased. And most importantly, the official guidance said to use 150 fuel only at approved manifold pressure settings, which were still 61 and 67 inches. Same as before. Callahan thought that was idiotic. Why develop a fuel that prevents detonation at high boost if you're not going to use high boost? It was like building a race car and never taking it past 30 miles per hour because the insurance company said so. So he did what mechanics have always done when official policy conflicts with engineering reality. He ignored the manual. The modification Callahan made wasn't mechanical, it was chemical. The 150 grade fuel arrived in separate drums, marked clearly to prevent mixing with lower grades. The 8th Air Force had standing orders: use 150 fuel only in designated aircraft, do not mix fuel grades, do not exceed approved manifold pressure settings. Callahan followed those orders for exactly 1 week. Then he stopped. The process was simple. Each P-51 at Bodney carried 485 gallons of fuel across internal tanks and 2 external drop tanks. The main tanks held standard 100 octane. Callahan would drain 10 gallons from the fuselage tank, replace it with 10 gallons of 150, then do the same with the drop tanks. The result was a hybrid mixture, approximately 20% 150 grade blended with 80% standard fuel. The ratio mattered. Too much 150 and the fuel burn rate changed, throwing off range calculations and confusing pilots who suddenly found their fuel gauges reading wrong. Too little, and there wasn't enough anti-knock protection for the higher manifold pressures Callahan intended to use. 20% was the sweet spot. Enough to prevent detonation, not enough to cause obvious performance changes that would alert engineering officers during post-flight inspections. The manifold pressure adjustment was simpler. Callahan had access to the automatic boost control regulator, a mechanical device that limited how much boost the supercharger could deliver at any given altitude. The regulator was sealed with a lead wire and a stamp from North American Aviation. Breaking that seal without authorization was grounds for court-martial. Callahan broke it anyway. He adjusted the regulator to allow 72 inches of manifold pressure instead of 67. Not a huge change, 5 inches. But at 25,000 feet, that 5 inches translated to roughly 150 additional horsepower and a speed increase of 15 to 20 miles per hour. Enough to chase Messerschmitts vertically, enough to surprise German pilots who thought they knew exactly how fast a Mustang could go. The first test flight was on July 8th, Crawford's aircraft only. Callahan briefed him personally before engine start. "You've got a custom fuel blend," Callahan said, keeping his voice low so the other crew, the chiefs, wouldn't hear. 20%, 150 grade. I've also adjusted your boost regulator. You'll see 72 inches on the gauge if you push past the war emergency gate. Hold it for no more than 3 minutes. Any longer and you'll cook the cylinders. Crawford looked at him for a long moment. "Is this going to get us both shot?" Callahan shrugged. "Only if it doesn't work." Crawford grinned. "Then let's make sure it works." The mission that morning was a bomber escort to Munich. Crawford's flight of 4 Mustangs rendezvoused with B-17 seconds over the English Channel, climbed to escort altitude at 28,000 feet, crossed into German airspace at 0930 hours. The bombers were from the 91st Bomb Group, 36 aircraft in tight formation, each one carrying 6,000 pounds of high explosive, aimed at ball-bearing factories in the Munich industrial district. The Luftwaffe response came 20 minutes from target. Radar stations along the French coast had tracked the bomber stream and scrambled interceptors from 3 different Jagdgeschwader. 20 Messerschmitt Bf-109s climbed from below. Another 12 Fäule-Wulf 190s dove from above. Standard Luftwaffe tactic. Divide the escorts, hit the bombers from multiple angles, escape before the Americans could reorganize. Crawford saw them first. 12 dark specks at 32,000 feet, silhouetted against high cirrus clouds. "Bandits high, 12 o'clock," he called over the radio. His flight broke formation and climbed. The Focke-Wulfs saw them coming and dove to meet them, building speed, planning to make one high-speed pass through the bombers and then climb away faster than the Mustangs could follow. Crawford pushed his throttle forward. Past military power, past the war emergency gate. He felt the safety wire snap. The manifold pressure gauge climbed, 60 inches, 65, 70. He kept pushing. 72 inches. The engine didn't knock. The temperature stayed green. The aircraft accelerated like nothing he'd ever felt. His airspeed indicator showed 420 miles per hour and still climbing, at 30,000 feet, in level flight. The lead Focke-Wulf never saw him coming. Crawford closed from 2,000 feet to 400 in 12 seconds. The German pilot was fixated on the bombers below, unaware that an American fighter was overtaking him at a speed that shouldn't have been possible. Crawford pressed the trigger. 650 caliber machine guns fired in unison, 3,000 rounds per minute, a stream of armor-piercing incendiary that walked across the Focke-Wulf's wing route and into the fuselage. The German aircraft shuddered, rolled inverted, and fell. Crawford's wingman, Second Lieutenant Thomas Bradley, tried to follow, but couldn't keep up. Bradley's Mustang was running standard fuel and standard boost. He watched Crawford pull away as if Bradley's aircraft were standing still. "What hell did they do to your plane?" Bradley asked over the radio. Crawford didn't answer. He was already reversing hard, pulling 6 Gs in a high-speed turn to engage the next target. The Fokker-Wulf pilot saw him this time and tried to climb away. Standard escape maneuver. Use the Fokker-Wulf's excellent rate of climb, get above the American, force him to either break off or stall trying to follow. Except Crawford didn't stall. His Mustang climbed at 4,000 feet per minute, nose high, engine howling, manifold pressure locked at 72 inches. The Fokker-Wulf pilot glanced back, saw the Mustang closing, tried to push his climb even steeper. It didn't matter. Crawford got guns on him at 800 feet range and fired. The Fokker-Wulf exploded, 2 kills in 90 seconds. But what happened next was more important than the kills. The remaining Fokker-Wulfs saw Crawford's maneuver and broke off their attack. They didn't climb. They didn't try to re-engage. They ran, straight and level at full throttle, heading east toward Germany, abandoning the bombers they were supposed to intercept. Because they had just watched an American fighter do something that wasn't supposed to be possible. A Mustang had outclimbed a Fokker-Wulf 190. That wasn't in the tactical briefings. That wasn't in the intelligence reports. And if one Mustang could do it, maybe others could too. The bombers reached Munich and dropped their loads without further interference. Crawford's flight escorted them home, landed at Bodny at 1400 hours. Ground crews swarmed Crawford's aircraft immediately, not because anything was wrong, but because pilots from other flights had heard Bradley's radio transmission. "What the hell did they do to your plane?" Everyone wanted to know. Callahan met Crawford at the hard stand. Crawford was still vibrating with adrenaline, hands shaking as he climbed out of the cockpit. "I got 2, he said. "Could have had 4, but I ran out of ammo. Mike, that thing flies like a completely different airplane. The engine just kept pulling. I've never felt acceleration like that." "What did you do?" Callahan looked around. Other pilots were watching. Crew chiefs were listening. The engineering officer, Captain Richard Halstead, was walking across the hard stand toward them. Callahan said quietly, "We'll talk later." But it was already too late. The word was out. Captain Halstead had been an automotive engineer in Detroit before the war. He knew engines, knew fuel chemistry, knew when something wasn't adding up. He walked up to Crawford's Mustang and stared at the engine cowling like he could see through the metal to the Merlin inside. "Lieutenant Crawford," Halstead said, "your aircraft performance report indicates sustained manifold pressure of 72 inches at altitude. That's 5 inches above war emergency specification. How did you achieve that?" Crawford glanced at Callahan. Callahan said nothing. Crawford said, "I pushed the throttle past the gate, sir." "War emergency power." Halstead shook his head. "War emergency is 67 inches. You logged 72. That requires either a malfunction in your boost regulator or an unauthorized modification. Which is it?" The silence stretched. Pilots and crew chiefs watched. Callahan knew he had 2 choices. Admit to the modification and face court-martial, or lie and claim it was a malfunction, which would ground Crawford's aircraft and possibly the entire squadron, while engineering investigated a non-existent problem. Neither option was good. Then, Crawford made the choice for him. "It wasn't a malfunction, sir. Sergeant Callahan adjusted my boost regulator, and he modified my fuel mix. That's why I was faster." Halstead turned to Callahan. His expression was unreadable. "Is that true, Sergeant?" Callahan met his eyes. "Yes, sir." "Do you understand that unauthorized modifications to flight control systems and fuel systems are violations of Article 92 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice? That I'm required to report this to the group commander?" "Yes, sir." Halstead nodded slowly. Then he looked at Crawford's aircraft again, looked at the gun camera film being unloaded by the armourer, looked at the 2 kill markings that would be painted on the fuselage that evening. Finally, he said, "Sergeant Callahan, report to my office at 1800 hours. We need to discuss your work in detail." And he walked away. What happened in Captain Halstead's office that evening would change how every Mustang in the 8th Air Force flew for the rest of the war. Callahan arrived at precisely 1800 hours, The engineering office was a small prefabricated building near the control tower, walls covered with technical drawings and performance charts. Halstead was sitting behind a desk made from packing crates, reading a folder. He didn't look up when Callahan entered. "Close the door, Sergeant." Callahan closed it. Halstead kept reading. The silence extended for nearly a full minute. Then Halstead closed the folder and looked at Callahan directly. "Tell me exactly what you did to Lieutenant Crawford's aircraft. Every detail. Don't leave anything out." Callahan explained it. The fuel blend, the 20% ratio, the boost regulator adjustment, the manifold pressure increase from 67 to 72 inches, the 3-minute time limit, the spark plug life trade-off. Everything. When he finished, Halstead asked, "Why didn't you submit this through proper channels? Request engineering approval? Run controlled tests?" Callahan said, "Because proper channels take months, sir. We're losing pilots now. Germans escape because we can't catch them. If I'd waited for approval, how many more pilots would die while forms got processed?" Halstead leaned back in his chair. "That's not your decision to make, Sergeant. We have procedures for a reason. Safety, quality control, standardization. You bypassed all of it. You put a pilot's life at risk based on your own calculations." "With respect, sir, pilots' lives are at risk every single mission. I calculated that the risk from the modification was lower than the risk from not having it." "And if you were wrong? If the engine had failed? If Lieutenant Crawford had been killed because you adjusted something you weren't authorized to adjust?" Callahan didn't answer. There was no good answer to that question. Halstead stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the flight line where Mustangs were being refueled and rearmed for tomorrow's mission. He said, "The reason I called you here is because I ran the numbers. Your fuel blend ratio, your boost pressure increase, your time limits, they're all correct, mathematically sound. Within the Merlin's engineering tolerances. If you had submitted this as a formal proposal, I would have approved it." Callahan blinked. That wasn't what he'd expected to hear. Halstead continued, "But you didn't submit it. You just did it. And now we have a problem, because Lieutenant Crawford's performance today is on record. Every pilot in the group knows his aircraft was faster. They're going to want the same thing. And if I approve your modification retroactively, I'm setting a precedent that any mechanic can modify any aircraft as long as it works. That's chaos." He turned back to face Callahan. "On the other hand, if I punish you for a modification that demonstrably improves combat performance and saves pilots' lives, I'm putting regulations ahead of mission effectiveness. That's also wrong." He sat back down. "So here's what's going to happen. I'm filing an engineering change proposal with 8th Air Force Headquarters, recommending your fuel blend and boost adjustment as standard procedure for all P-51 groups. I'll claim it was my idea, based on testing I conducted. Your name won't appear anywhere in the documentation. You'll face no charges, but you will never modify another aircraft without my written approval. Understood?" Callahan understood. Halstead was protecting him while taking the credit, or the blame, depending on how headquarters responded. It was the smartest way to handle the situation. "Understood, sir." "Good. Now tell me how many aircraft you can modify per day if I give you authorization." Callahan thought about it. "The fuel blend is simple. 5 minutes per aircraft. The boost regulator takes longer, maybe 30 minutes. If I train other crew chiefs, we could do 6 aircraft per day." Halstead did the math. The group has 72 operational Mustangs. That's 12 days to modify the entire fleet. 10 days if we work through the night, sir. Then that's what we'll do. Start tonight. Begin with the aircraft scheduled for tomorrow's mission. I'll brief the pilots in the morning." Callahan saluted. Halstead didn't return it. Instead, he picked up the folder again and said, "And Sergeant, next time you decide to reinvent aviation fuel chemistry, run it. Past me first." "Yes, sir." Callahan worked through the night. By dawn on July 10th, 8 Mustangs had the modified fuel blend and adjusted boost regulators. The morning mission was another bomber escort, this time to Augsburg. All 8 modified aircraft flew. 7 came back. 1 was shot down by flak, nothing to do with the engine. But the 7 that returned logged sustained speeds 15 to 20 miles per hour faster than unmodified Mustangs. Climb rates were improved by 800 feet per minute. Acceleration at altitude was noticeably better, and for the first time, German fighters who tried to escape vertically found themselves being caught. The pilots' debriefings that afternoon were unanimous. Whatever Callahan had done, they wanted it on all the aircraft. Captain Halstead filed his engineering change proposal on July 11th. It included test data, performance calculations, and a recommendation to adopt the modifications Air Force-wide. The proposal arrived at 8th Air Force Headquarters in High Wycombe on July 13th. It sat on desks for 2 days while staff officers debated the implications. The debate wasn't about whether the modification worked. The performance data was clear. The debate was about precedent. If they approved a field modification by a crew chief, were they opening the door to every mechanic in every group inventing their own improvements? What about quality control? What about standardization? What about the contract with North American Aviation, which specified exact fuel grades and boost pressure limits? On July 15th, Major General William Kepner, commander of 8 Fighter Command, read Halstead's proposal and made a decision. He called Halstead directly. "Captain, your proposal is technically sound, but I'm not approving it." Halstead felt his stomach drop. "Sir, may I ask why?" "Because it's not my decision. This needs to come from Materiel Command. They're responsible for aircraft modifications. If I approve it and something goes wrong, it's my ass. But I'll tell you what I will do. I'll forward your proposal to Wright Field with my recommendation for immediate testing. If they approve it, we'll implement it. Until then, your group can continue using the modification on a trial basis. Understood?" "Understood, sir." "And Captain, off the record, tell your crew chief he did good work. If this gets approved, a lot of pilots will owe him their lives." The call ended. Halstead relayed the message to Callahan. Trial basis only, no official approval yet, but permission to continue while Wright Field ran tests. That was enough. By July 20th, all 72 Mustangs in the 352 fighter group were modified. Other groups heard about it through the pilot grapevine. Crew chiefs started asking questions. How do you adjust the boost regulator? What's the fuel blend ratio? How do you keep the engineering officers from finding out? Word spread. The modifications spread with it, group to group, mechanic to mechanic, unofficial, unauthorized, and absolutely effective. The 357th Fighter Group adopted it on July 23rd, the 4 Fighter Group on July 28th. By mid-August, somewhere between 200 and 300 Mustangs in England were flying with modified fuel blends and adjusted boost regulators. Officially, none of this was happening. No paperwork, no approvals, no documentation. Unofficially, American pilots were suddenly out-climbing and outrunning German fighters that had dominated them for months, and the Germans noticed. Lieutenant Klaus Hoffmann of Jagdgeschwader 26 first encountered the modified Mustangs on July 22, 1944, at 27,000 feet over the Ruhr Valley. Hoffmann was an experienced pilot with 31 confirmed kills, a veteran of the Eastern Front who'd transferred west after being wounded near Kursk. He knew American fighters intimately. He'd fought P-47, Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings, and P-51 Mustangs for 8 months. He knew their strengths, their weaknesses, and most importantly, their limitations. The Mustang was fast in level flight, he knew that. Good range, stable gun platform, dangerous if you let it get behind you. But it couldn't climb with a Messerschmitt, and its acceleration at altitude was nothing special. Standard Luftwaffe doctrine was simple. If you got into trouble with a Mustang, climb. Use the Bf-109's superior power-to-weight ratio, get above him, force him to either break off or stall. It worked, every time. Except on July 22nd, it didn't work. Hoffmann's flight of 4 Messerschmitts bounced a formation of B-17 seconds near Dortmund. They made their attack pass, shot down 1 bomber, and started to climb away. Standard procedure. 3 Mustangs from the 357th Fighter Group saw them and gave chase. Hoffmann watched them in his mirror, unworried. The Americans were below him, climbing hard, but losing ground with every second. He could see the lead Mustang's nose high, almost vertical, the pilot trying desperately to keep up. Then the Mustang did something impossible. It accelerated. Not in level flight, where Mustangs were supposed to be fast. Not in a dive, where everything accelerated. The nose came up even steeper. The aircraft seemed to hang on its propeller for a moment, and then it kept climbing, faster than before. Hoffmann watched his altimeter, 28,000 feet, 29,000, 30,000. The Mustang was still closing. At 31,000 feet, Hoffmann pushed his throttle to the emergency gate and pulled even steeper. The Mustang stayed with him. At 32,000 feet, Hoffmann's Messerschmitt began to shudder, approaching its service ceiling. The Mustang was 200 meters behind him and still climbing. Hoffmann rolled inverted and dove. It was the only option left. In the dive, he had the advantage. The Messerschmitt's heavier wing loading meant it accelerated faster going down. He'd lose the American, circle back, re-engage on his terms. Except the Mustang followed him into the dive and matched his speed. At 600 kilometers per hour, at 4,000 meters altitude, the American pilot was on his tail, guns tracking, and Hoffmann realized with cold certainty that if he didn't do something immediately, he was going to die. He broke hard left, pulling 8 Gs, vision tunneling from the force. The Mustang broke with him. Hoffmann reversed right. The Mustang reversed. He tried a climbing spiral. The Mustang climbed faster. Finally, Hoffmann dove for the deck, leveled off at 50 meters above the Ruhr River, and ran for home at full throttle. The Mustang didn't pursue. It pulled up, rejoined its formation, and continued escorting the bombers as if nothing unusual had happened. Hoffmann landed at his airfield near Düsseldorf 40 minutes later, hands still shaking. He climbed out of his cockpit and immediately sought out his squadron commander, Major Franz Heinz. "Sir," Hoffmann said, "the Americans have modified their Mustangs. They're climbing faster than they should, much faster." Heinz looked skeptical. "Define much faster." "Fast enough to stay with a Bf-109 at maximum combat power in a vertical climb to 32,000 feet. Heinz's skepticism faded. "You're certain?" "I watched it happen, sir. I used every trick I know. Emergency power, spiral climb, high-speed dive. Nothing worked. That Mustang stayed with me through maneuvers that should have been impossible." Other pilots in Hoffmann's flight confirmed the account. All 4 had watched the American fighter perform beyond its documented capabilities. Heinz filed a report with Luftflotte, 3 headquarters that evening. The report detailed the engagement, included estimates of the Mustang's climb rate and acceleration, and concluded with a request for updated intelligence on American fighter modifications. The report reached Luftwaffe intelligence on July 24th. It was the 4th such report in 6 days. Other units had filed similar accounts. Mustangs climbing faster, accelerating more quickly, maintaining higher speeds at altitude. The reports were consistent enough that intelligence couldn't dismiss them as pilot error or exaggeration. Something had changed. Oberst Werner Straib, a night fighter ace now assigned to Luftwaffe technical intelligence, was tasked with determining what the Americans had done. He reviewed every report, studied reconnaissance photographs of American airfields, interrogated captured pilots, and examined wreckage from downed Mustangs. He found nothing. The airframes looked identical. The engines appeared standard. The propellers were unchanged. Whatever modification the Americans had made, it wasn't visible. On August 1st, 1944, Straib wrote a classified assessment for Luftwaffe High Command. The relevant section read, "American P-51 fighters have demonstrated performance improvements inconsistent with known specifications. Observed climb rates exceed documented capabilities by approximately 25%. Maximum speed at altitude appears increased by 15 to 20 km per hour. The nature of this modification remains unknown. Possibility 1. Engine modifications, including increased boost pressure or altered supercharger gearing. Possibility 2. Improved fuel formulation, allowing higher manifold pressures without detonation. Possibility 3. Weight reduction through removal of equipment or ammunition. Recommendation: increase caution when engaging P-51 aircraft. Previous tactical assumptions regarding vertical escape maneuvers are no longer reliable. The assessment was distributed to every Jagdgeschwader commander on the Western Front. The message was clear. The Americans had changed something. German pilots could no longer assume they could outclimb a Prius. Mustang, and anyone who tried might die proving it wrong. The psychological impact was immediate. German pilots who had confidently engaged Mustangs for months began approaching encounters with new caution. The vertical escape, once a reliable tactic, became a gamble. Some pilots adapted by avoiding high-altitude combat entirely, staying below 20,000 feet where the Messerschmitt's lighter weight still provided an advantage. Others became more aggressive, trying to force close-range turning fights where the Bf-109's superior roll rate might compensate for the Mustang's new performance edge. But aggression without technological parity just meant dying faster. Throughout August, Luftwaffe fighter losses increased, while bomber intercept success rates declined. German pilots were hesitant, uncertain, fighting an enemy they thought they understood but no longer did. And the worst part was not knowing what had changed. It wasn't a new weapon, wasn't a new tactic. It was something subtle, something invisible, something that made American fighters perform just 5 or 10% better than before. But 5% in combat was the difference between escape and death. For the Americans, the modifications became standard practice. By September 1st, more than 400 Mustangs across all 8th Air Force groups were operating with modified fuel blends and adjusted boost regulators. The procedure was still unofficial, still not documented in maintenance manuals, still technically unauthorized. But it was also undeniably effective. Kill ratios improved, pilot losses decreased, bomber formations reached their targets with fewer fighter losses. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. On September 7th, the Wright Field test results finally arrived at V-8 Fighter Command headquarters. The Materiel Command had spent 6 weeks running and controlled tests on a P-51D using Callahan's exact modifications. They tested fuel blends ranging from 10% to 40% 150 grade. They tested manifold pressures from 67 to 75 inches. They measured performance, monitored engine wear, calculated maintenance requirements, and analyzed every possible failure mode. Their conclusion validated everything Callahan had done. The 20% fuel blend provided optimal anti-knock protection without significantly affecting fuel consumption. The 72-inch manifold pressure was within the Merlin's structural limits and produced approximately 140 additional horsepower at 25,000 feet. Engine wear increased by roughly 15%, which translated to overhaul intervals of 175 hours instead of 200 hours. That was acceptable. Spark plug life dropped from 30 hours to 12 hours. Also acceptable. The performance gains outweighed the maintenance costs. Wright Field recommended immediate adoption of the modifications across all P-51 units. On September 15, 1944, 8th Air Force issued Technical Order 0160J19, officially approving modified fuel blends and increased manifold pressure for all Mustang variants. The order specified 20% 150 grade fuel mixture, manifold pressure up to 72 inches, and a maximum duration of 3 minutes at full boost. It included detailed maintenance procedures, inspection intervals, and parts replacement schedules. The order did not mention Technical Sergeant Michael Callahan. It did not mention the 352 fighter group. It did not mention the 2 months of unofficial modifications that had preceded official approval. The credit went to Wright Field for conducting thorough engineering analysis. Captain Halstead was mentioned in a footnote as having submitted the initial proposal. Callahan's name appeared nowhere. By October, the modifications were universal. Every P-51 group in England, then groups in Italy, then groups in the Pacific, as Mustangs deployed against Japan. The fuel blending procedures became routine. New crew chiefs learned them in training. The adjusted boost regulators became factory standard on P-51Ds produced after November 1944. North American Aviation incorporated the changes into their production specifications, claiming credit for continuous improvement of the Mustang design. The Germans never figured it out. Post-war interrogations of Luftwaffe pilots revealed that most attributed the Mustang's improved performance to a new engine variant or structural modifications. Some thought the Americans had reduced armor to save weight. Others believed it was an entirely new aircraft that just looked like a P-51. The truth, that it was simply better fuel and 5 more inches of manifold pressure, seemed too mundane to explain such a significant tactical advantage. The irony deepened after the war. In 1947, the Smithsonian Institution published a comprehensive technical history of American fighter development. The section on the P-51 included detailed specifications for various models, including the increased manifold pressure authorized in September 1944. The text attributed the modification to ongoing engineering development by North American Aviation and Army Air Force's Materiel Command. Callahan was not mentioned. In 1952, a young aerospace engineer named Robert Williams was researching P-51 performance for his doctoral thesis at MIT. He reviewed maintenance logs from the 352 fighter group and noticed something peculiar. Between July and September 1944, several aircraft showed consistent manifold pressure readings 5 inches above specification, weeks before the official technical order authorized it. Williams tracked down Captain Halstead, now retired and working for Boeing in Seattle, and asked about the discrepancy. Halstead told him the truth. About Callahan, about Crawford's first test flight, about the night modifications and the unofficial spread of techniques across multiple groups, about how one crew chief with a screwdriver and a willingness to break regulations had given American pilots an advantage that Luftwaffe intelligence never understood. Williams tried to include the story in his thesis. His academic advisor removed it. The advisor explained that crediting unauthorized field modifications over official engineering programs would undermine the narrative of systematic American technical superiority. It would suggest that informal innovation by enlisted mechanics was more effective than formal research by credentialed engineers. That message conflicted with the institutional story the Air Force wanted to tell. Williams published his thesis without Callahan's story. It earned him his PhD. He went to work for Lockheed, designing the F-104 starfighter. He never forgot what he'd learned, that sometimes the best engineering comes from people willing to ignore what the manual says and trust what the machine can actually do. But he never published the story either. Michael Callahan stayed in the Army Air Forces through the end of the war. He was promoted to Master Sergeant in November 1944. He served with the 352 Fighter Group until May 1945, maintaining Mustangs through the final months of combat. He never received a medal for his modifications. No commendation, no recognition, no mention in unit histories. When the war ended, he mustered out of service and returned to Pittsburgh, where he worked as an automotive mechanic for the next 37 years. Lieutenant Crawford survived the war. He flew 83 combat missions and shot down 13 enemy aircraft. Every one of those missions was flown in a Mustang with modified fuel and adjusted boost pressure. After the war, he became a commercial pilot for TWA, flying DC-3 seconds and constellations across the Atlantic. He stayed in contact with Callahan for the rest of his life, sending a Christmas card every year with a simple message written inside, "Still flying because of you." In 1983, a military aviation magazine published an article about unsung heroes of World War II. Crawford read it and wrote a letter to the editor describing Callahan's modifications and their impact on the air war. The letter was published. 3 months later, Crawford received a call from the Air Force Historical Research Agency. They wanted to interview both him and Callahan for their oral history project. The interview took place in January 1984. Crawford and Callahan, both in their 60s, sat together and described in detail what had happened 40 years earlier. The interviewer recorded everything, catalogued it, filed it in the archives at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. The recording was classified as restricted for 20 years to avoid embarrassing retired officers who had claimed credit for work they didn't do. By the time the restriction lifted in 2004, both Crawford and Callahan were dead. Crawford passed in 1997, Callahan in 2001. Neither lived to see their story become public. The oral history recording exists in the Air Force archives, available to researchers who know to look for it. Most don't. The official histories still credit Wright Field and North American Aviation for the P-51's performance improvements in late 1944. The truth is more complicated and more human. Yes, Wright Field validated the modifications. Yes, North American incorporated them into production. But the innovation came from a crew chief working alone at night with a glass jar and a wrench, willing to risk court-martial because he was tired of watching pilots die in aircraft that could have been faster. In 2012, the National Museum of the United States Air Force opened a new exhibit on P-51 Mustang development. The exhibit included a detailed timeline of technical improvements throughout the war. September 1944 was marked as the date when enhanced fuel formulations and increased manifold pressure authorization improved P-51 performance by 15%. The placard credited the Army, Air Force's Materiel Command. There was no mention of field modifications, no mention of unauthorized testing, no mention of Callahan. But in a glass case near the exhibit exit, there's a different kind of artifact. It's a maintenance log from the 352 Fighter Group, dated July 1944. The log shows manifold pressure readings for Lieutenant Crawford's aircraft, consistently listing 72 inches weeks before such readings were officially authorized. Next to the log is a photograph, slightly faded, showing a crew chief standing beside a Mustang. The caption identifies him as Technical Sergeant Michael Callahan, Maintenance Supervisor, Summer 1944. The museum docents usually don't mention the connection. Visitors walk past the exhibit, read about official engineering programs, admire the restored P-51 inches the main gallery, and leave believing that American air superiority came from superior technology and superior resources. They're not wrong. It did. But it also came from mechanics who understood that regulations exist to prevent disasters, not to prevent thinking. The final irony is that Callahan's approach, unauthorized field modifications based on operator experience, became standard practice in modern military aviation. Every combat unit now has modification authorization programs. Pilots and maintainers can propose changes based on operational experience. The best ideas get tested, validated, and adopted fleet-wide. It's formalized now, with paperwork and approval chains, but the principle is the same. The people actually using the equipment often know better than the people who designed it. Callahan knew that in 1944. He just didn't have the paperwork. Klaus Hoffmann survived the war. He was shot down over Belgium in December 1944 and spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. After repatriation in 1946, he returned to Germany and became a commercial pilot for Lufthansa. In 1972, he attended a veterans' reunion in Munich, where former Luftwaffe and American pilots met to share stories. He recounted his encounter with the modified Mustang over the Ruhr Valley, describing his confusion and fear when his standard tactics failed. An American pilot in the room, a former member of the 357th Fighter Group, laughed and said, "That was probably one of ours. We started running hot fuel blends that summer, made the planes a lot faster." Hoffman asked what he meant. The American explained about the fuel modifications and the boost pressure adjustments about how it was all done unofficially by crew chiefs working between missions. Hoffman sat quietly for a moment, processing this information. Then he said, "You mean all those months we were trying to understand what you had changed, and it was just mechanics mixing fuel differently?" The American nodded. "That's about it." Hoffman shook his head. "Our intelligence spent thousands of man-hours analyzing your aircraft. We interrogated captured pilots. We studied wreckage. We assumed it was something complex, some new technology, and it was just fuel." The American smiled. "Sometimes the simple solutions are the hardest to see." Hoffman agreed. They shook hands. The conversation moved to other topics, but Hoffman never forgot that moment, the realization that he'd nearly died because of a modification so simple that German intelligence had overlooked it entirely. Not because German engineers weren't smart, but because they assumed American improvements would be as formal and systematic as their own. They never considered that an individual mechanic might just decide to improve things on his own initiative. That assumption cost the Luftwaffe hundreds of pilots and contributed to the loss of air superiority over Germany in the final year of the war. Not decisively, not solely, but meaningfully. The modified Mustangs gave American pilots an edge when fighting at altitude. That edge translated to more bomber escorts reaching their targets, more German interceptors shot down, more pressure on an already strained Luftwaffe. The margins in air combat are thin. 5 extra inches of manifold pressure and 20% better fuel was enough to shift those margins decisively. The final count is impossible to calculate precisely. How many German pilots died because they tried to outclimb modified Mustangs? How many American pilots survived because their engines produced 140 more horsepower? How many bombers reached their targets because their escorts could now catch the interceptors? The numbers are speculative, but the impact was real, and it all started with a crew chief, a glass jar, and the willingness to break a safety wire. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.